Hello, I'm the Hard Times Guy, and this is going to be the latest in a series of a playlist I call Sunday Morning, which is, it's the Hard Times Guy, but it's a different strain of the Hard Times Guy where I don't talk about antiques and auctions and some of the things that I talk about in most of my videos. Today I'm going to talk about a friend of mine named Morris Rodgers. And in Sunday Morning number 2, I think the title of that was Making Choices. Towards the end of that video I mentioned that I had done the Graveside services for Morris, and I promised that someday I'd make a video and share those with any of the viewers that might be interested. And so today's that day. I'm making that video today. Because of what it is, I'm going to have to do some reading today, and I've done that in past videos, and I never did like the way it came across when I was reading something. It just seems so unnatural, but the only way I can do this video is to read the script of what I said that day. And that day, standing by Morris's grave out at Booty at the Right River Baptist Church Cemetery, that's what I did. I read from a script. So I'm going to do that again today. That day, the people at a graveside service of a person don't need background information. You're talking about a person and they're interested enough in that person to be at his graveside services. They know what you're talking about. They know that person as well or better than you do. So I didn't have to elaborate much. Everybody knew what I was saying when I was saying it. Today I am going to stop occasionally and provide a little bit more information about what it is I'm saying, because you, the viewer, some of you may know Morris Rodgers, but some of you may have known him at some point in his life and lost track of him, or some of you may have known him late in his life and didn't know about the early parts of his life. So I'm going to stop and fill in some information today as I go through this. The service started with music. Janet had some friends of hers and Morris come to sing. There were, I don't know, 2 or 3 musicians. Some of them might have sang with her. They had a girl that sang a couple of songs. Skinny blonde-headed girl. I say girl, that girl means she was my age or younger. Younger than me, probably. Skinny girl, I can't remember her name. And then Larry Summerton sang Into the Mystic. I can't hardly hear that song anymore without thinking of Morris. This is the script that I used the day Morris was buried. Janet asked me to conduct a service for him at his graveside, and this is what I said. Welcome, friends and family of Morris Rodgers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Luke Mooneyham. I'm not a preacher. For his own reasons, Morris had a thing about preachers. I don't know why, because I know of at least 2 preachers, both named Kenny, that Morris knew and liked. 8.5 years ago, I spoke at the gravesite when we buried his granddaughter, Amber. I looked at my notes from that time, and I said on that day that Morris and Janice asked me to conduct a service because they loved Amber. And I agreed to do it because I loved Morris and Janet. I have exactly those same sentiments today, and I am honored that Janet asked me to speak today. I first became aware of Morris Rodgers when he was 18 or 19. He was the guy who did crazy and spectacular things off the high board at Thornton Park swimming pool. He lived across the street from the park, and he often sat on the porch of his home and played the guitar. He drove an Impala convertible, and he rode a 650 BSA with ape hanger handlebars. Essentially, he was the 1960 version of Fonzie before there was a Fonzie. I'm going to stop there for a minute and I'm going to talk about Fonzie. If you're my age, you know who Fonzie is, or who Fonzie was. If you're a young person, you may or may not know anything about Fonzie, because he was a character on television back in the time when there was a series on television called Happy Days. And if you are too young to have been privy to that, or if you haven't watched reruns of that on television, you probably don't have any idea who Fonzie is. If you're interested in Fonzie, get on your computer and Google it, and you can research, find out who Fonzie was. But Morris, in his young life, he was an individual much like Fonzie is in the Happy Days series. And those of you who knew him then know why I say that. I actually met Morris and began a friendship with him a few years later during the rock star phase of his life, when he was Morris Rodgers and the Continentals. Many of his friends from that era still refer to him as Mousy. There may be some pretty incredible Mousy stories among the recollections of this group. Going to talk just a minute about what I call the rock and roll era, Morris's life. When Morris was young, he had ambitions to be a rock singer. I know they made at least one record, like a bebop record. And he sang often, had a lot of gigs where they played bars and hotels and places like that. Played for dances and other things, for like proms, and played, I think sometimes they played like a lead-in group for the Carnations or the Trendales, or another popular group in our time that was from Louisville. Morris Rodgers and the Continentals. Pretty good band. And Morris lived he lived the life. In fact, he had at least two children that I know of showed up late in his life and said, "Hey, my mom tells me that you're my dad." Kind of a thing that were products of that lifestyle that Morris led, and he tried to do it just like the big timers would do it, you know. So that was, that was the life that he had as a young man, and probably for a little while. I think marrying Janet probably slowed that down some, and he finally got away from that and went on to the next phase. When Janet asked me to do this and I agreed, I told my wife that I might not be able to do anything but just stand there and cry. I decided that if that happened, it would be okay. Morris and I bird hunted together for nearly 40 years. That's years and miles of walking behind a bird dog and riding in a pickup truck with Morris. Morris was a talker, and I am not. After all those years of being his captive audience, I think I know how Morse thought about any subject you might mention. I'm going to stop again and talk for just a minute about what I just said. You might think a guy who makes YouTube videos where he just sits there and talks and can do it seemingly for long enough to bore anybody to sleep, that I am a talker. But generally, no, I'm not. I'm kind of out of my element doing this. Most of the time when there's talking going on, I'm a listener. I sit for long periods of time observing and listening while other people talk in the normal realm of my life and the things that I do and the places that I go. So that's what I was to Morse too. And those of you that know Morse know that you didn't have much choice where Morse was concerned, because he was a talker. He could talk the leg off a table. He got started on something and he just expounded on anything and everything for a long period of time. So when I spent all this time, a 40-year period of my life, walking around in a field behind bird dogs or riding in a pickup truck to get somewhere, and we made several trips to western Oklahoma, and that takes 14, 18 hours depending on the weather and other things. So I was Morse's captive audience for many, many hours, and I've heard Morse's opinion and Morse's stories and Morse's recollections and Morse's viewpoint on anything you care to mention. All right, let's go reading again. No discussion of Morse is complete without mention of Janet. If I were to write a book that was a summation of Morse thoughts about Janet, the title would be Janet Rodgers, Superwoman. He thought she was the smartest business manager, the best field laborer, gardener, food preserver, cook, housekeeper, livestock tender, wife, mother, and grandmother ever. He told me a jillion times how amazing she was, and that she did all those things with only half her heart function. Janet, I know he acted like you couldn't do anything without his help and direction. But believe me, you were his hero, the love of his life, and his favorite person on earth. He loved his children and grandchildren too. I wish I had $1 for every story I ever heard that began with that little rascal, or that little devil, or that little angel, as he referred to his grandchildren. Morse and Janet suffered the untimely loss of loved ones in their lives more than any two people should have to. We aren't supposed to have to bury our children and our grandchildren. The story I'm about to share happened a few months after Morse and Janet lost their son, Mike Scott, unexpectedly at a tragically young age. We'll stop there for a minute and talk about what I just said. I said their son, Mike Scott, which indicates to you that the boy probably wasn't actually Morse's son. Janet was married before she was married to Morse, and she was married to a man whose last name was Scott. I don't know what his first name was, but everybody called him Tookie. And so I knew him as Tookie Scott. And so that's what I'm going to refer to him from the rest of this story if I mention him again. Tookie Scott was the natural father of Janet's two boys, Sam Scott and Mike Scott. But when Morris and Janet got married, both those boys were young. Mike was the youngest, and Morris became their father, and Morris was their father as much as any father could be. He loved those boys, and he loved them just like they were his. And he and Mike especially had a bond about things, that they both loved to do a lot of the same things, and they did them together, and they thought alike and they acted alike. And Morris, I don't know how to emphasize it any more than what I'm telling you, but he loved those boys like they were his. They were his sons. And when Mike died, and I don't know how old he was, I'm going to say was in his 20s, middle to late 20s probably. And he was in Germany, in the service. I think he was in the U.S. Army. And he was stationed in Germany. And he had an aneurysm that burst, and he died suddenly and unexpectedly. And that just absolutely almost destroyed Morris. He had an awful time with that. He had long periods of depression, and he would have times when he would be going about his daily routine. He worked at General Motors during that time, and so did I. And I had we worked in close proximity to one another. And I would sometimes look and see him, and he would just be sitting with his hand in his head sobbing. And he had periods like that often and for a long time. So this is about one of those times, the story I'm about to tell. It says, a few months after Morris and Janet lost their son, Mike Scott, unexpectedly at a tragically young age. On a day much like today, Morris and I were hunting on a farm in the area of Dixon Chapel Church. I stepped over a fallen tree and was headed down a hill toward a little sometime stream. We were going to hunt around a bean field on the top of the hill on the other side of the stream. I heard Morris say, "Luke." I turned, and he was sitting on the tree I had just crossed, and tears were streaming down his face. I started toward him, and he held up his hand and he said, "Stop. Don't say anything. I just need to sit here a minute." And I knew it was one of those times when something had prompted him to think about Mike. So I sat down on the tree too, and I began to cry. For a while, we were oblivious to our surroundings. We just sat there looking at the ground between our feet and cried. "Luke?" It was Morris again. I looked up, and there were 4 bird dogs standing there looking at us, as if to say, "Guys, what the heck's going on?" One of the dog's tail began a slow wag, and he took a hesitant step toward Morris. Morris stood up and told the dogs to get going. Then he looked at me and said, "Thank you." That's all he said. And I said nothing. Many of you know exactly what I mean when I say that Morris Rodgers had his own way of doing things. He believed he could do anything he set his mind to. When he decided to do something, he just went to work toward doing it until he was satisfied himself that he could do whatever it was. There are any number of examples of this in his life, times where he defied conventional wisdom, but eventually worked out his own solution to things in a way that satisfied him. I might mention that once he was satisfied, it didn't matter if it satisfied anybody else. Two examples of this are guitar and golf. I have listened to Morris explain how there are many hundreds of chords possible on a guitar. I have seen him demonstrate the conventional way to make the G chord, and then show 3 other ways he can create the same chord. This, much to the chagrin of the novice trying to follow what he was saying, or another guitarist trying to follow what Morris was doing during a jam session. Most people would agree that for someone who was self-taught, he was a pretty fair guitarist. Likewise, he taught himself to play golf. He bought a range membership, and he hit golf balls until his hands were blistered and bleeding. He hired Wimpy Riggs to give him a golf lesson. He so frustrated Wimpy that after 20 minutes, Wimpy gave Morris his money back and told him he couldn't help him. His golf swing was something to behold, but after playing for a little more than a year, I saw him shoot a legitimate 69 from the back tees at Christmas Lake. From time to time through the years, I invited Morris to attend church with me. Times when we were having a music group like homecoming, or times when we were having something like the Fall Bazaar soup supper. Occasionally he would accept when it was something that didn't include preaching. He did, however, talk to me about what he referred to as religious things. I was never successful initiating a conversation on that subject, but when he had a question or there was some issue he wanted to know about, we sometimes engaged in a long discussion. He was always the moderator, and the discussion was over when he was ready for it to be over. Several years, maybe as many as 15, after Mike died, Morris and I were in a truck with bird dogs in the back, headed somewhere, and he said to me, "Do you remember that time we sat on that tree over by Dixon and I just cried?" I told him I did. He said, "Do you think God knows what we need even when we don't?" I told him I was sure of it. In fact, there's a scripture in Romans that says the Spirit makes intercession for us even when we don't know what we need. I don't have my Bible here today, so I'm not going to read it, but that scripture's in Romans 8, verses 26 and 27. If you want to go there and read that, I'd suggest that you do. In fact, the whole chapter of Romans 8 is one of my favorite chapters, and I would suggest that just every once in a while you read that whole chapter. It'll help you. Morris then went on some long discourse about Native American Indians and their spirit life. I didn't know where he was going with it, so I just listened and said yes once in a while. This is how most of our conversations were. Morris did 97% of the talking, and I injected an once in a while. Some of you may have noticed about Morris, sometimes it's hard to get a word in edgewise. Finally he said, "I know God, and I want God in my life. I just can't do it the way church people do it. I know that you are a godly man and you go to church. Does that make any sense to you?" I said, "Morris, God looks at your heart. That means that He knows the essence of the spirit of a man, regardless of what he does or what he says. He looked at the thief on the cross in just such a way and said, "Today I'll see you in paradise." Morris, you do a lot of things in a different way than I would do it. I deal with it. I wish I could give you a better explanation, but there is a whole lot that I don't understand myself. My faith allows me to know that my Redeemer lives in the person of Jesus Christ. I know that I will someday stand with Him in the presence of God. God is way bigger than we can imagine. I'm sure that He can deal with the Morris Rodgers way of doing things. I have a large room built on the back of my pole barn. We use it for family functions and other gatherings. Some refer to it as my man cave because it is decorated the way I want it. The walls are covered with family things, old signs and other antiques, birds and bird dogs, and a collection of other things to my liking. I'm going to stop there for a minute because a lot of you who know me and have seen other videos of mine, I'm sitting in that room right now. That room is where I make most of my videos. The room I'm talking about here at Morris's Graveside is this room. And the picture I'm about to tell you about is hanging right over there on that wall. I can see it from here. There's a picture of Morris hanging on the west wall among the hunting pictures. The picture was taken within a few hundred feet of the place where Morris and I sat on a fallen tree and cried together. It has some words below the glass along with the picture. I took it down and brought it with me today. I stopped recording for a minute and I went and got that picture off the wall. There it is. It has a card in it on the right side that says, "A man who follows God is always on the right path," and it's got a picture of a man walking down a path in a field. And on the left side of that picture is Morris, and he's standing probably within 100 yards of where we sat on that log and cried. He's got on an orange coat and an orange hat. He's got a Franchi 20 gauge automatic in the crook of his arm, and there's a white bird dog standing there by him. And I made a little caption for that picture, and I said, "A man who follows a bird dog and is paying attention may draw closer to God." On that day, when I stand in the presence of God, I expect to see my friend Morris Rodgers again. I'm the Hard Times guy. Have a good day.